In this video, we'll tell the story of the Brokaw Mansion in New York City. The mansion is the subject of an important New York court case involving the legal principle of waste. Our story begins with Isaac Brokaw, who was born in New Jersey in 1835, the descendant of French Huguenots. In 1856, when Isaac was only 21, he and his brother started a business manufacturing and selling men's and children's clothing. It was fabulously successful, and Brokaw became very wealthy. At his death, his estate would have been worth the modern equivalent of about $260 million. In 1887, Isaac began construction of a house at Fifth Avenue and 79th Street in Manhattan. After his death in 1913, his son George lived in the mansion, which was built in the French chateau style. The mansion was similar to other grand houses constructed along Fifth Avenue during the same period. A few of them survive to this day, usually occupied by nonprofit organizations or museums. Isaac's mansion was directly across the street from the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Central Park, a prime Manhattan location. Two of George's brothers, Irving and Howard, were left other properties on the same block by Isaac's will. The mansion to George was left for his life, with remainder to his issue who survived him. But if no issue survived him, then upon George's death, the mansion was to go to Isaac's other heirs. In 1923, George married Clare Booth. She was 19 and he was 43 and had never previously been married. Clare did not come from a moneyed family and she had only a high school education, but she was brilliant, beautiful, and extremely ambitious. Their daughter Anne was born almost immediately, but Clare had little interest in being a mother. Anne was educated by tutors until she was 12 and then shipped off to boarding school. Clare hated living in the mansion, and it was not long until she hated George as well. George was a lawyer, but by the time of his marriage to Clare, he had become a hopeless alcoholic. Clare remembered of the marriage, "I know all about violence and physical abuse because my first husband used to beat me severely when he got drunk. Once I can remember coming home from a party and walking up our vast marble staircase at the Fifth Avenue house while he was hitting me. I thought if I just gave him one shove down the staircase, I would be rid of him forever." In 1926, George filed a suit to gain permission to tear down the mansion. It was costly to maintain and ill-suited to modern life of that era. George intended to replace the mansion with an apartment building, but he was opposed by his two brothers who owned property on the same block. One of the brothers, Irving, was also a lawyer. Apparently, their reasoning was that they might ultimately get title to the mansion and could combine it with their own properties to build a large apartment building, although that would happen only if George's daughter Anne predeceased him, which must have seemed unlikely. George lost his case at the trial level before Justice Ernest Hammer, and in 1930 the New York Appellate Division affirmed his loss. There was a stirring and often quoted dissent by Judge Edward Finch, who thought there was no good reason to prevent George from demolishing the mansion. In 1929, while the appeal of the court case was pending, Clare divorced George after 6 years of marriage. As matters worked out, their daughter Anne did outlive her father. George died of a heart attack in 1935 at the age of 55. Anne was killed in an automobile accident at the age of 19 while she was a student at Stanford University in 1944. The later history of the family is uniquely interesting. In 1935, Clare married Henry Luce. She was 32 and Luce was 38. He was the owner and publisher of Time magazine, Life magazine, and Fortune. Luce was widely considered to be one of the most influential men in America, as well as being extremely wealthy. He and Clare became perhaps the ultimate political power couple. Clare developed an impressive political base in her own right. Earlier in life, she had supported Franklin Roosevelt, but she became a staunch Republican. She wrote a best-selling nonfiction book about America's lack of preparation for World War II. and in 1942 she ran for a seat in Congress from Connecticut and won. Clare gave the keynote speech at the 1944 Republican National Convention, the first woman of either party to do so. In 1952, Clare campaigned vigorously for President Eisenhower, and she was rewarded by an appointment as ambassador to Italy. Throughout her remaining life, she remained both a vigorous anti-communist and a committed feminist. Clare also wrote a number of plays and screenplays, one of which was nominated for an Academy Award. In sum, Clare lived an extraordinary life. She was a successful writer and actress, was an editor at Vanity Fair. She was an early advocate of independence for the European colonies abroad, but also for full civil rights for African Americans at home. While some of her political attitudes seem dated and misdirected today, in other ways, she was remarkably ahead of her times. To return for a moment to George Brokaw, 2 years after his divorce from Clare, he remarried in 1931. His second wife was Frances Ford Seymour, a Canadian-born socialite. Their marriage lasted for 4 years, until George's death in 1935, and they had one child, Frances, who was nicknamed Pan. Frances inherited the bulk of George's estate upon his death, and thus became fabulously wealthy. Almost immediately after George's death, Frances met and married actor Henry Fonda in 1936. Frances and Henry Fonda had 2 children who became famous in their own right, Jane and Peter Fonda. Sadly, their marriage was troubled, and when Peter Fonda asked Frances for a divorce in 1950, she was confined to a mental institution and took her own life. Peter Fonda died in 2019, but Jane remains alive and very active today. As for the Brokaw mansion itself, it's no longer extant. After George Brokaw's death, it passed through various hands. For a while was the headquarters of the Institute of Radio Engineers. The New York Landmarks Commission designated it a historical landmark, but at that time the commission had no legal authority to prevent the mansion's destruction. In 1964, a developer proposed to raze the mansion and build a 26-story cooperative apartment building. Despite protests and newspaper editorials supporting its preservation, the building was demolished and the apartments were constructed. The protests were effective in one way, however. The mayor of New York subsequently signed legislation that gave the Landmarks Commission the legal authority to stop destruction of designated landmarks. That, in turn, led to the famous Penn Central case in New York City. The Brokaw Mansion was one of the last architectural remnants of New York City's Gilded Age. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about its most unusual history.